Hi, this session we're going to look at requirements. Now, I talk about requirements, but realistically, when you think in a project, the first thing we really have at the very start is an understanding of what the project needs from a product point of view. Okay, so this is looking at the product. What's the overall objective we're going to be delivering? What's the new website or the process document, application form, relocated office, whatever it happens to be? What is the product we're going to produce? If you look at a session I've done on product-based planning, it starts to look at that alongside another that looks at cone of uncertainty. Right? And I'll go through some of those now in a higher level again to explain what we're saying here. Really. But think about it. At the beginning of the project, what I understand is what is the product going to be? What am I going to deliver? So right at the start, right, it's about the product, the overall objective. Right? Now, as we know, that product is made up of a smaller group of high-level requirements, for example, or major products, if you like. It's the next level down. And that's what we understand right at the beginning of the project. Okay. Now, I know that people say, well, we come with a list of requirements. This is a sort of a product build solution, a bit like Scrum, where people do come with a list of requirements. If you see the session I've done on Scrum, we start looking at that. We have 3 games and people are providing a set of requirements they want for those, game updates or whatever product you're updating. And this is quite logical. However, in a project, we need to look at things a little bit more in depth. And so initially you can think of, I'm coming up with a set of products first of all, which people will have a list about what they require. But the key objective throughout this, as you'll see in this session on prioritization, is to understand what are the key elements that I need to deliver for a startup. In other words, we need to prioritize for what we need to deliver from a solution point of view. Right? What needs to be delivered to realize the beneficial change we're putting in place. So this is the consideration we have. But if we start off with the products first of all, what do we expect to deliver? We can then do that later, and that's what the product on that section on product-based planning looks at. A bit more detail. So let's have a look at what are products, what are requirements. As you see at the beginning, they're just a set of products, high level, and as we go through the sequence of events, the phases, remember we looked at something called the cone of uncertainty, which looks at the amount of detail we have as we go through the project. So the project time frame is this way. This is right at the very beginning of the project. The first phase, as you will, whatever you want to call that. In this case, all we know are the major products. Right. When we go into the second phase and put a lot more design behind the project, in other words, start planning, looking at more detail about the scope that we need and all the other mechanisms, how we're going to deliver it, the solution we're going to deliver, and other things, how we're handling risk, etc., management of the project. We look at that. The main thing we're doing here is breaking the products down. We need to break them down first of all. Until I do that, I can't do anything else. Right? And then we can prioritize. And it's at that point here that when we get into this phase here, the second phase, that the product now becomes a requirement. By prioritizing, we understand why the product is required for the project. And it's a key to understand why it's needed for the project, primarily for the beneficial change. However, we're going to look at a bit more detail how we understand that from the perspective of the business, the techies, and anybody else involved in the project. When I say technical, I mean the people who are going to be producing it, the suppliers, if you wish, right? But at the moment, it's a product and it now becomes a requirement because we are going to prioritize at this point in time. So we're going to prioritize our requirement. Prioritize the product and turn it into a requirement. Because priority says that must be delivered, these should be delivered, and these could be, but we can use those as contingency as well. And therefore what is left over, I won't this time around. That only means really at this point in time, as we go through the project, of course that could change. Right? Now, normally when we get to that, we start to understand a lot more about that. But of course, remember, it's only a first cut in this particular phase. As we go through the project and start delivering, right, prioritization and products and scope would therefore change as well, right? And it's just how we handle that change. Main thing to understand, if anything's got to be changed, it needs the right authority to sign it off. Okay, we'll look a bit more about that when we look at prioritization. So products become requirements during the phase when we're doing the planning, because now we're using prioritization to understand the need for the project. Now, certain terminology are about these days, and we have things called epics and themes, right? Epics and themes. Now, which way around just depends. My personal feeling is the epic, like a film, is the overall film, like Lawrence of Arabia, for example. The themes are the different sections within that film that we see, first stages, out in the desert, stuff like this sort of thing. And these are the themes that are subsets of epics. A bit like getting a big boulder, right? You get a boulder, you break it down into rocks, and you break the rocks down into pebbles. So the epic is up here, the main overall deliverable. The themes are the major requirements underneath that, maybe the level down if you wish, and then anything else down is broken into smaller requirements. Okay, now they're all subject to something that we call user story, a user story approach, right? And what this means is that as a user story, I say, as so-and-so or representing so-and-so, I want this for my deliverable because it's going to do that for me, right? So as a role in the project, I want this, or the project needs this requirement, right? Whatever that requirement happens to be, because whatever the rationale is, whatever value it's going to give, whatever it's going to do for the project. For instance, if you're producing a new website, as we discussed in some other area, and we need a new logo, the business want the new logo on the website because that represents their change in the business, or they've won this competition, for example, right? That sort of thing. So that becomes something that is actually required and becomes something you must deliver, right? A bit like, the sponge in a cake, really. We'll talk about it a bit more in prioritization again. So the user story takes each product and says, as so-and-so or representing so-and-so, I want this to be included in the project, in the outcome, in the overall deliverable, because of what it's going to do for you or do for your customer who you're representing. Now, what's important, you need to do this really from a business and a supplier technical perspective, and a management role, a balanced role in between. And we'll look at those roles in another session. The business analyst in particular gets involved in this from a point of view of an objective view between the two main areas. But obviously at the end of the day, the business have the overall say of things, because business, their requirements. But it doesn't mean to say it stops there. Technical may say, well, we need to put that certain switch in, or that particular area in, or that particular linkage in, because it's got to do something. The business will say, well, why do I need that? But it needs to be in there to make the thing work functionally. Like the logo, the techies will say, why do we need the logo on board? But from a business perspective, this is the whole point. That logo represents this award they've won, or whatever it happens to be. Okay. So I want this because of so-and-so. And we apply that through here, and this really needs to be done collaboratively. It is very important that this is actually done collaboratively. So we need to do this collaboratively. Not just send it off and have a round robin, that takes too long for one thing. And secondly, it needs to be discussed and have a consensus of agreement about what they are. But it's still at a point in time. So even going through this second phase, you could be doing this quite a number of times, right, to have a look at that. Okay. So we have epics and themes, subject to user stories, and therefore we have that requirement now understood, what it's need for the project. Okay. So how you record that, there are various methods of doing that. I'm just looking at the overview here. Now, there's one thing there's one guidance in some respects to help you through this, okay, to understand what is a requirement. And a chap called Bill Wake, right, produced this acronym called INVEST, right, INVEST. And we'll look at that very briefly. INVEST means independent. What is important is that we do not have duplicates, right? Duplicates. No, right? Make sure we have one requirement represents that specific requirement. Now, it doesn't matter if that requirement actually is used a number of times throughout the project. We only need the requirement once, right? We're not going to build it 5 times, we're going to build it once and use it. So it needs to be independent. So make sure we've got no duplicates, nothing looks the same. Negotiable. meaning that it is a placeholder. At this time, it is marking an understanding of what we think we need for that particular requirement, sometimes pretty well defined. But it does mean that it's open to editing and changing if necessary. So it just makes a point that we've put something in there, hopefully very specific, and if not, then at least we know we can change it. So it's a placeholder. All requirements need to have some value. It needs to have some value for the solution. Doesn't matter how small it is. Even putting the candles on the cake add a value, right? So the could haves also need to have value. If they don't, they should not be there in the first place. Well, they ought not to be there, might be a better way of saying it, in the first place, right? So it doesn't matter. In this case, we're not talking about value from a point of view of benefits, from a point of view it's needed for it, but it must add value to the overall solution if it's in there in the first place. Estimable. We need to be able to put some estimate on it. Now, general guidance is 1 to 5 days, right? Guidance, I mean, it's all guidance, really. It doesn't matter if you have to have half a day or a quarter a day. And sometimes that can happen. From a project perspective, that doesn't usually happen into that smaller detail, right? But it doesn't stop you doing that. It's just a guidance. And think about it, if I'm in a time box, I don't want the time boxes too short, because otherwise, again, we've got more overheads than producing the requirements or the requirements within the time box. We'll look at that again in another session. More than 5 days, the opposite problem. You over swamp the time box, it might give you very little contingency or flexibility within the time box to deliver what you need to deliver. So it needs to be estimable, but that's a guidance. The next one needs to be small. The smaller you are, remember the point here, this bar here, this line here represents the size of the requirement. The smaller the requirement, the more accurate you can get on the estimation. So there's a linkage between them. The more accurate you can get on the estimation. Right? So the smaller you get. But again, there's no point in going down to the minute detail unless you really have to. You might do that later within the build time in the time box, but not right now. And also, the last one, it needs to be testable. It needs to stand on its own so you can test it. Now, one interesting thing to think about on this is if I've got a requirement here, right, and it's a 4-day requirement and it's made up of 3 other requirements, one is 2, 1 day and 1 day, for example, these all need to be small enough so it gives me some accuracy. It needs to be testable. Now, that particular requirement there might not be testable on its own. But if I'm building these 2 to complete this one here, then I can build that and test it. So I could take that out later, as you'll see. But the thing is, it's testable with the overall requirement, this one that's 4 days long. So as long as it's testable at this point, which the 4-day requirement is, the other 3 might not be testable on their own. I have to put them all together to make it to be testable. And therefore, how small enough is that? Can I put some estimation on it? Right? So all these things need to be considered with requirements. Right? So think about that as well. Now, I'll take Bill Wakes off because we can always look at that a bit later. There's something else we need to explain on requirements, because at the end, there are 2 main types of requirements we have in our projects. And I want to explain that as the last thing in this session. We have 2 types of requirements: functional and non-functional. Okay, now the functional one are the ones we tend to look at in the main. And the functional one is, what are we delivering, right? What are we delivering from a functional point of view? You know, the new document, the relocated office, for example. That is the functional bit, okay? And that's usually what we tend to concentrate on. The non-functional bit is how well, right? How well, or other supporting functions, right? So there are 2 areas in here. We'll have a look at those. So the non-functional bit looks at one of a few different things. Usually, how well is something going to work, which usually is down at requirement level. So this is actually at the requirement itself. When we look at the functional, non-functional, how well, and the supporting bit, this is usually at solution level, right? Solution level. So the how well bit here links to things like detailed acceptance criteria about how this is going to function. It's going to function at a certain distance. It's going to have certain response time. The office is going to be able within certain distance of each other, within groups and teams, and their communication, ease of access from these sort of points. So detailed acceptance criteria is usually very much part of the non-functional requirement about how well. And all we tend to look at that in more detail through the time box, as you'll see. From a supporting point of view, at the solution level, we're looking at things like training, help desk, for instance, help desk support, network support, for example. A few years ago, working on a project that we were outsourcing a lot of work to another country. And of course, one of the first things that network support came and asked me was, how do we look at the network, Anthony, when we have a problem with it? Right? Where's the breakdown? We need to support this. And these are things we need to address before we close the project, before we actually go live with it. So we're up and running as best as possible. Training. If we're putting out a new system out there, or a new desktop, or a new functionality, or a new operating process, we need to have some training on that before we do that. The same with help. All these other things, these are non-functional at the solution end. So we need to bear those things in mind. So these are the requirements too. The requirement from the point of view of how big they are, epics, themes, and then specific requirements. But user story applies to all of them to be able to help prioritize and understand their need for the project. Right? The non-functional part on supporting and therefore requirement level, as well as how well something is going to work, because we always tend to concentrate on the functional, that which we are delivering overall. Right. But remember, all that detail comes up as we go through the project. This is logical in any case. We don't understand the themes and epics right at the very beginning, except probably the epic here and maybe high-level themes at that point. But then we just understand them as products. Then we can start breaking them down. Remember, it's all a matter of control, making sure we have the right scope, make the right prioritization, and adjusting with the right authority to change it. These are requirements and how we get them down through the project. Because somebody comes along the list, we don't know the linkage. As you'll see in product-based planning, we don't know the linkage between them from a point of view of dependency. Hope that's helped to unravel a few ideas and food for thought.